Now let's look at lesson number 8 for just a moment. You shall not bear false witness. Exodus 20:16 just simply says that. You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. Now God understood and understands us so well. Even in this ancient time in our family story, God knew how difficult it would be for us to hold together as a community without a bedrock of truth and honesty upon which we can depend, especially in public life. When truth is about spin, when even observable facts are debated and debased, when truth appears to somehow have versions, then the cohesion of the community itself is constantly threatened. In general, that is the dynamic that this word addresses. More specifically, however, this word acknowledges that the community cannot hold together without a system of justice upon which we can stake our lives. This command, quite literally, is a prohibition against perjury. We are not to lie in court. We are not to lie under oath. We are not to be false witnesses. And it's from this commandment and its subsequent understanding that we today get our prohibition against hearsay testimony. If you answer or repeat what you do not know to be true from your own personal experience, you are a false witness, even if the source from which you heard what you repeat is unimpeachable. Now, I grew up in a legal family, generations of lawyers stretching back across the decades, back as far as the Civil War and beyond. My father was a district attorney during the height of the civil rights movement in Alabama and prosecuted 2 of the most famous murder cases from that period. Later, he sat on the bench as a judge for 23 years that his father had sat on for 43 years. I knew what a tort was before I knew how to tie my own shoelaces. Truthfulness and carefulness of speech were so important to my father. I remember him telling me on more than one occasion that if I had not seen something with my own eyes, I should never repeat it. You don't want to perjure yourself, he would say. And then he said, if stretching the truth becomes a habit, you will forget who you are. My father was a wise man. In this word, it seems to me that God is saying much the same thing to us. If your life and community are not firmly planted on a bedrock of personally attested truth, you will forget who you are, and you'll lose everything that matters. Truth matters. If there was ever a word for this time, it is this one. Truth matters, and y'all, it doesn't have versions. Above all else, it cannot be manipulated for personal gain without dire consequences to self and to the community. In the beloved community, in God's loving embrace, we just don't do that. It's important at the same time to acknowledge that this word is not a prohibition against lying in general. Now, lying is generally discouraged in the scriptures, although it is a bit nuanced in places. For example, lying is sometimes permitted to save a life, or to make peace, or even to elevate God's status. Sometimes even little white lies are permitted for the greater good. In the study, I give an example from the school of Shammai and the school of Hillel as they talked about, what is moral speech? And the question was asked, what does one say to a bride? And Shammai, I think, said, she is described as she is. And Hillel said, every bride is described as graceful and beautiful. And the rabbis sided with Hillel. And you'll understand this, I think, in just a moment as we look into the language itself. Lying is a bit nuanced. It is discouraged, but it is a bit nuanced in the Scriptures. Still, this word, this commandment, reminds us that lying, especially when it becomes systemic, when it damages institutions of justice, lying in those circumstances is in every circumstance incompatible with the values of God, and it has no place in God's household. So no lying in court, no testifying to what you do not know to be absolutely true. Well, let's push a little deeper. In the Hebrew of this word in Exodus, the writer chooses a very interesting phrase that we translate as false witness. It's Eid Shakar, and don't go by my pronunciation. It's written out for you in Hebrew in your study book, but I pronounce it Eid Shakar. Now, this is a different phrase from the one that's used in the commandments in Deuteronomy, which is Eid Shav. Eid Shav is just empty, vain, lying. But Eid Shakar, that's different. In the other instances where we find it in the Hebrew Scriptures, it's usually translated as fraudulent or wrongfully injurious. It's about injury and not simply untruthfulness. Think about that nuance for a moment. You shall not testify of your neighbor in a way that is fraudulent or wrongfully injurious. One of the ways that the ancients understood this prohibition was as a guard against slander. Well, what's slander? It is defined as a false charge or misrepresentation which defames or damages a person's reputation. Reputation was hugely important in the ancient world. One's livelihood, one's tribe, the marriages that could be arranged, even the reputation of God hinged on the reputation of God's people, hinged on having a good and honorable reputation in the community. You shall not utter the wrongfully injurious word. You shall not speak of another in a way that tears down their reputation. Now, this prohibition extended even beyond words spoken to include innuendo, facial expression, or tones of voice that are used to tear people down. Gossip was a primary way that this word was understood to be violated. We are not to speak the wrongfully injurious word. Yipes! What we need to remember in considering this word is that at its heart, it focuses on truthfulness, honesty, and trustworthy of the legal system set up in the community to ensure justice, to make sure that all get a fair shake. And on top of that, it is about any speech or behavior that is wrongfully injurious, hence the rabbi siding with Hillel about the graceful words toward the bride. You are never to speak, shrug, or eye roll another person to a lower reputation. This prohibition also implies that we are not to inflict that kind of injury on ourselves either. Think about it. Sometimes we are our own false witnesses, aren't we? Back in the 90s, Linda Ronstadt and Emmylou Harris and Dolly Parton put out an album called Trio. And one of the songs is called Telling Me Lies. And the lyric that I think of in this regard is, I am my own false witness. I cover my ears, I close my eyes, and still I hear you telling me lies. Sometimes the running dialogue in our heads can be the most damaging lies of all, can't it? I'm fat, I'm old, I'm ugly, I'm unlovable, I'm rejectable, I'm a failure, I can't learn this, I'm no good at that. We know how to tell ourselves some whoppers. And sometimes we can even tell ourselves lies from the other end of the spectrum that can cause as much injury as the fat, dumb failure lies. For example, when I was a little girl, I was a very sick child, and I had been in the hospital for quite a period of time. I'd been in a coma, and it was everybody had thought that I was going to die, and obviously I didn't. And I remember I was 5, 6 years old, and I remember after I'd gotten out of the hospital and gotten a little bit strong, that my mother took me downtown. We were going to Planters Mercantile so that I could buy hair ribbons. And I was so excited. And back in those days, this was, when was this? It was still in the late 50s, early 60s. And we always dressed to go to town in my little small town. And I remember I had a little puffy skirt, and I had Capezio shoes with daisies on the toes. And we were going downtown to Planters Mercantile. And I was walking down the sidewalk holding my mother's hand, and one of my mom's friends, who hadn't seen me since I got out of the hospital, ran across the street. You could jaywalk in that little town, think Mayberry. Ran across the street, and she squatted down next to me, and she took my cheek in her hand, and she pinched it, and she said, "Oh, Jeannie, you're just a little miracle." And I believed her. And for years, I tried to live up to that word that had been spoken to me. I was supposed to do the undoable thing. I was supposed to pull a rabbit out of a hat. I was supposed to make things work that couldn't work. I was supposed to be the little miracle. It was a lovely intention, but an injurious word to me. And because I did it, not because she did it. It was because I did that to myself. And that's what I'm talking about here. We can be our own false witnesses when we take those tapes that run around in our heads and act as if they are somehow the inspired New Testament text and must be guarded at all costs. Remember, as you're thinking about this in your groups, y'all, remember that God's creative means is speech. What we say, we create, just like God did. In our love letter, God wants us to be clear that life cannot be what God intends it to be for all of us until we decide that we will stop speaking the wrongfully injurious word toward any of us. This is so hard in this day and age when we are so divided and we think of each other as enemies and we don't like each other, and especially in the political realm, to practice this word, to practice never speaking out loud or inside the wrongfully injurious word is tough duty. This is not easy. This is not a no-brainer. Do y'all get this? We are not to run people down, not individuals, not whole vast groups of people, not those closest to us, not those who disappoint us, and not ourselves. We are not to utter the wrongfully injurious word. No eye rolls at the transgender child. No demeaning remarks about another's appearance. No racially tinged jokes. No faked photos for political opponents. No dirty tricks. No self-aggrandizing exaggerations. No scapegoating. No self-put-downs. I remember back when this was years ago, I had a wonderful friend named Sherry, and I was going through a really hard time with my former marriage, and I was just hurting so much and blaming myself for everything, the wrongfully injurious word, or at least not completely true injurious word. And I was talking to her about that, and I remember her putting her arm around me and saying, "Stop being so mean to my friend." There's a part of that from God in this word. God looks at us and puts God's arm around and says, "Stop being so mean to my child." No wrongfully injurious words. God makes plain that in the household of God, we guard our speech carefully. And above all, don't lose this. Above all, we determine to protect the honesty and integrity of the legal system. You shall not bear false witness.